What keeps you alive every day? How can you run, play video games, or do all the things that you enjoy doing? Well, it's your heart that drives you. It's critical in understanding the physiology of the human body. With its complex pathways of veins, arteries, and capillaries, the cardiovascular system keeps life pumping through you. The heart, blood vessels, and blood help to transport vital nutrients throughout the body, as well as remove metabolic waste. They also help to protect the body and regulate body temperature. The cardiovascular system has three main functions: to transport nutrients, oxygen, and hormones to cells throughout the body, and to remove metabolic waste such as carbon dioxide and nitrogenous wastes, to provide protection of the body by white blood cells, antibodies, and complement proteins that circulate in the blood and defend the body against foreign microbes and toxins, and finally, the regulation of body temperature, fluid pH, and water content of cells. The human heart is an organ that pumps blood throughout the body via the circulatory system, supplying oxygen and nutrients to the tissues and removing carbon dioxide and other wastes. The human heart has 4 chambers: 2 upper chambers, the atria, and 2 lower ones, the ventricles, according to the National Institutes of Health. The right atrium and the right ventricle together make up the right heart, and the left atrium and the left ventricle make up the left heart. A wall of muscle, called the septum, separates the 2 sides of the heart. A double-walled sac, called the pericardium, encases the heart, which serves to protect the heart and anchor it inside the chest. Between the outer layer, the parietal pericardium, and the inner layer, the serous pericardium, runs pericardial fluid, which lubricates the heart during contractions and movements of the lungs and diaphragm. The heart's outer wall consists of 3 layers. The outermost wall layer, or epicardium, is the inner wall of the pericardium. The middle layer, or myocardium, contains the muscle that contracts. The genetic disorder, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, HCM for short, prevents the heart from contracting properly. A mutation on the MYH7 gene on chromosome 14 makes the gene create the beta-myosin heavy chain protein at a rapid speed, so more type 2 myosin is then created. With the overload of type 2 myosin, the muscles become thicker than usual, so the body has to work harder to pump blood, thus causing the HCM. HCM is most common in children, and its symptoms include chest pain, difficulty of breathing, and heart palpitations. Those symptoms often show up long after HCM has been in effect or never show up at all. Next, the inner layer, or endocardium, is the lining that contacts the blood. The tricuspid valve and the mitral valve make up the atrioventricular, or AV valves, which connect the atria and the ventricles. The pulmonary semilunar valve separates the right ventricle from the pulmonary artery, and the aortic valve separates the left ventricle from the aorta. The heartstrings, or chordae tendineae, anchor the valves to heart muscles. The sinoatrial node produces the electrical pulses that drive heart contractions. The heart circulates blood through 2 pathways, the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. In the pulmonary circuit, deoxygenated blood leaves the right ventricle of the heart via the pulmonary artery and travels to the lungs, then returns as oxygenated blood to the left atrium of the heart via the pulmonary vein. In the systemic circuit, oxygenated blood leaves the body via the left ventricle to the aorta, and from there enters the arteries and capillaries, where it supplies the body's tissue with oxygen. Deoxygenated blood returns via veins to the vena cava, re-entering the heart's right atrium. Of course, the heart is also a muscle, so it needs a fresh supply of oxygen and nutrients. There are 2 homeostasis actions within the cardiovascular system. The first is intrinsic cardiac regulation. It responds to a change in the volume of blood entering the heart. When the heart stretches, intrinsic cardiac regulation causes the force of ventricular contraction to respond to the stretch. The more stretch there is, the more blood is ejected from the heart via the aortic valve. The second action is heart rate control. This is achieved by the autonomic nervous system via the sympathetic nervous system, or SNS, and the parasympathetic nervous system, PNS. The SNS releases epinephrine and norepinephrine to accelerate the heart. The PNS releases acetylcholine to slow down the heart. As creatures have evolved, they have developed more complex systems of oxygenating blood. Invertebrates are low on the evolutionary scale and thus have a less evolved heart. In fact, invertebrates don't even have a heart. They absorb oxygen straight through their skin. Next on the evolutionary scale are fish. Fish only have a basic circulatory system whose heart has 2 chambers. A transitional organism from water to land is next in evolution, frogs. Frogs have a 3-chambered heart in order to keep oxygenated and deoxygenated blood apart in the 2 atriums. Reptiles follow after frogs with a 3.5-chambered heart. That half chamber is a small septum. Finally, there's the human heart. The human heart contains 4 chambers so that it can very effectively keep deoxygenated and oxygenated blood apart. The new ventricle, the 4th chamber, helps to push deoxygenated blood back to the lungs to receive the oxygen. Lungs use simple diffusion. We breathe oxygen in through our nose and mouth. It passes down a pipe called the larynx, which then splits off from your esophagus and turns into your trachea, which then branches to form 2 bronchi, one of which goes into each lung. These bronchi branch off again, forming narrower and narrower tubes called bronchioles. These bronchioles eventually end in tiny sacs called alveoli. Each alveolus is about 1/5 of a millimeter in diameter, but everyone has around 300 million of them. Alveoli are little bags of thin, moist membranes, and they are totally covered in tiny, narrow, blood-carrying capillaries. Oxygen dissolves through the membrane and is absorbed by the blood in these capillaries, which then goes off through the circulatory system to make cells all over your body happy and healthy. But while the alveoli are handing over the oxygen, the capillaries are switching it out for carbon dioxide that the circulatory system just picked up from all over the body. So the alveoli and the capillaries basically just swap one gas for another. From there, the alveoli takes the CO2 and squeezes it out through the bronchioles, the bronchi, the trachea, and finally out of your nose and or mouth. Lungs act like a pump, but they don't actually have any muscles in them that cause them to contract and expand. For that, we have this big flat layer of muscles that sit right beneath the lungs, called the thoracic diaphragm. At the end of an exhalation, your diaphragm is relaxed and looks like an arc pushing up on the bottom of your lungs and crowds them so that they don't have very much volume. But when you breathe in, the diaphragm contracts and flattens out, allowing the lungs to open up. As the volume of a container grows larger, the pressure inside it goes down, and the fluids, including air, always flow down their pressure gradient from higher pressure to lower pressure. So as the pressure in our lungs goes down, air flows into them. When the diaphragm relaxes, the pressure inside the lungs becomes higher than the air outside, and the deoxygenated air rushes out. The circulatory system works on a pumping mechanism just like the respiratory system, except instead of moving air into and out of the lungs, it moves blood into and out of the lungs. The circulatory system moves oxygenated blood out of the lungs to the places in your body that need it, and then brings the deoxygenated blood back to your lungs. The heart's job is to basically power the circulatory system, move the blood all around your body and get it back to the lungs so that you can pick up more oxygen and get rid of the CO2. As a result, the circulatory system of mammals essentially makes a figure 8. Oxygenated blood is pumped from the heart to the rest of the body, and then when it makes its way back to the heart again, it is then pumped on a shorter circuit to the lungs to pick up more oxygen and unload CO2 before it goes back to the heart and starts the whole cycle over again. So even though the heart does all the heavy lifting and the circulatory system, the lungs are the home base for the red blood cells, the postal workers that carry the oxygen and CO2. Now the way that your circulatory system moves the blood around is pretty nifty. A 4-chambered heart, which is a big muscle, is set up so that one chamber, the left ventricle, has very high pressure. In fact, the reason it seems like the heart is situated a little bit to the left of center is because the left ventricle is so big and muscly. It has to be that way in order to keep the pressure high enough that the oxygenated blood will get out of there. From the left ventricle, the blood moves through the aorta, a giant tube, and then through the arteries, which are blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart, to the rest of the body. Arteries are muscular and thick-walled to maintain high pressure as the blood travels along. As arteries branch off to go to different places, they form smaller arterioles and finally very little capillary beds, which through their huge surface area facilitate the delivery of oxygen to all the cells in the body that need it. The capillary beds are also where blood picks up CO2, so from there the blood keeps moving down the pressure gradient through a series of veins. These do the opposite of what the arteries did, so instead of splitting off from each other to become smaller and smaller, little ones flow together to make bigger and bigger veins to carry the deoxygenated blood back to the heart. This is necessary because the pressure in the circulatory system keeps dropping lower and lower until the blood flows into two major veins. The first is the inferior vena cava, which runs pretty much down the center of the body and handles blood coming from the lower part of your body. The second is the superior vena cava, which sits on top of the heart and collects the blood from the upper body. Together they run into the right atrium of the heart, which is the point of the lowest pressure in the circulatory system. So all this deoxygenated blood is now back to the heart and needs to soak up more oxygen, so it flows into the right ventricle and then into the pulmonary artery, the path to the lung. After the blood makes its way into the alveoli to pick up some fresh oxygen, it flows into the pulmonary vein, and from there it enters the heart again, where it flows into the left atrium and then into the left ventricle, continuing the whole body circuit again. Blood is a specialized body fluid. It has four main components: plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Blood has many different functions, including transporting oxygen and nutrients to the lungs and tissues, forming blood clots to prevent excess blood loss, carrying cells and antibodies that fight infection, bringing waste products to the kidneys and liver, which filter and clean the blood, and regulating body temperature. The blood that runs through the veins, arteries, and capillaries is known as whole blood, a mixture of about 55% plasma and 45% blood cells. About 7 to 8% of your total body weight is blood. An average-sized man has about 12 pints of blood in his body, and an average-sized woman has about 9 pints. The liquid component of blood is called plasma, a mixture of water, sugar, fat, protein, and salts. The main job of plasma is to transport blood cells throughout your body, along with nutrients, waste products, antibodies, clotting proteins, chemical messengers such as hormones, and proteins that help maintain the body's fluid balance. Known for their bright red color, red cells, or erythrocytes, are the most cells in the blood, accounting for about 40 to 45% of its volume. The shape of a red blood cell is a biconcave disc with a flattened center. In other words, both faces of the disc have shallow bow-like indentions. A red blood cell kind of looks like a donut. Production of red blood cells is controlled by erythropoietin, a hormone produced primarily by the kidneys. Red blood cells start as immature cells in the bone marrow, and after approximately 7 days of maturation, are released into the bloodstream. Unlike many other cells, red blood cells have no nucleus and can easily change shape, helping them fit through various blood vessels in your body. However, while the lack of a nucleus makes a red blood cell more flexible, it also limits the life of the cell as it travels through the smallest blood vessels, damaging the cell's membranes and depleting its energy supplies. The red blood cell survives on average only 120 days. Red cells contain a special protein called hemoglobin, which helps carry oxygen from the lungs to the rest of the body and then returns carbon dioxide from the body to the lungs so it can be exhaled. Blood appears red because of the large number of red blood cells, which can get their color from the hemoglobin. The percentage of whole blood volume that is made up of red blood cells is called the hematocrit, and is a common measure of red blood cell levels. White blood cells, or leukocytes, protect the body from infection. They are much fewer in number than red blood cells, accounting for about 1% of your blood. When a tissue is damaged or has an infection, the number of leukocytes increases. Leukocytes are formed in the small ends of bones. They can be classed as granular or non-granular. There are 3 types of granular leukocytes: eosinophils, neutrophils, and basophils, and 3 types of non-granular: monocytes, T-cell lymphocytes, and B-cell lymphocytes. The most common type of white blood cell is the neutrophil, which is the immediate response cell and accounts for 55 to 70% of the total white blood cell count. Each neutrophil lives less than a day, so your bone marrow must constantly make new neutrophils to maintain protection against infection. Transfusion of neutrophils is generally not effective since they do not remain in the body for very long. The other major type of white blood cell is a lymphocyte. There are two main populations of these cells. T lymphocytes help regulate the function of other immune cells and directly attack various infected cells and tumors, and B lymphocytes make antibodies, which are proteins that specifically target bacteria, viruses, and other foreign materials. Unlike red and white blood cells, platelets are not actually cells, but rather small fragments of cells. Platelets help the blood clotting process, or coagulation, by gathering at the site of an injury, sticking to the lining of the injured blood vessel, and forming a platform on which blood coagulation can occur. This results in the formation of fibrin clot, which covers the wound and prevents blood from leaking out. Fibrin also forms the initial scaffolding upon which new tissue forms, thus promoting healing. A higher than normal number of platelets can cause unnecessary clotting, which can lead to strokes and heart attacks. However, thanks to advances made in antiplatelet therapies, there are treatments available to help prevent these potentially fatal events. Conversely, lower than normal counts can lead to extensive bleeding. Blood vessels form a tubular network throughout the body that allows blood to flow from the heart to every body cell and then back to the heart. The three types of blood vessels are arteries, capillaries, and veins. Each blood vessel consists of a layered wall surrounding a central blood-containing space called lumen. The vessels of the pulmonary and systemic circuits carry blood to the tissues of the entire body. In the pulmonary circuit, blood takes up oxygen in the lungs. In the systemic circuit, oxygenated blood is distributed to body tissues. Systemic and pulmonary circulatory systems efficiently deliver oxygen to the tissues of the body and remove waste products such as carbon dioxide. Arterial blood, except in the pulmonary artery, is highly saturated with oxygen and supplies oxygen to the body's tissues. Venous blood, except in the pulmonary vein, is deoxygenated and returned to the heart to be pumped into the lungs for reoxygenation. Nutrients carried in the blood are released to tissues via the permeable endothelium of blood vessels. Immune cells move throughout the circulatory system and are able to rapidly permeate the walls of blood vessels to attend sites of injury or infection. Blood vessels can increase or decrease blood flow near the surface of the body, either increasing or reducing the amount of heat loss as a means of regulating body temperature. Capillaries distribute the nutrients and oxygen to the body's tissue and remove deoxygenated blood and waste. They are extremely thin. The walls are only 1 cell thick and connect the arterioles with venules, which are very small veins. Capillaries make the exchange of molecules between blood and interstitial fluid possible. Sphincters open and close to regulate the flow of blood through capillary beds. The crucial exchange of substances required for cellular metabolism takes place through the capillary endothelium, which allows cells of the various tissues to take up oxygen and nutrients and to expel carbon dioxide and waste. Heart contractions generate blood pressure, the fluid pressure that blood exerts against the vessel walls. Blood pressure is expressed in mmHg. Normal blood pressure in adults is 120 mmHg over 80 mmHg, the systolic pressure over the diastolic pressure, when measured at the brachial artery in the arm, which is a standard point of reference. Blood pressure is highest in arteries and lowest in veins. Arteries and veins are composed of 3 tissue layers. The thick outermost layer of a vessel, tunica adventitia or tunica externa, is made of a connective tissue. The middle layer, tunica media, is thicker and contains more contractile tissue in arteries than in veins. It consists of circularly arranged elastic fibers, connective tissue, and smooth muscle cells. The inner layer, tunica intima, is the thinnest layer, comprised of a single layer of endothelium supported by a subendothelial layer. Capillaries consist of a single layer of endothelium and associated connective tissue. This graph shows the diastolic and systolic pressure relationships and what they convey. The systolic over diastolic relationship, represented by this graph, is shown in a y over x relationship. An excellent blood pressure relationship, systolic over diastolic, is anywhere from 105 to 130 over 70 to 85. The average normal blood pressure is recorded to be around 120 over 80. Any blood pressure measurement skewed to the left of the excellent blood pressure relationship either requires medication/too low meds or means that the person is an athlete or a child. People can be at risk of hypotension, low blood pressure, from heart failure, heart muscle disease, and even sepsis, a severe blood infection. Any blood pressure measurement skewed to the right requires prescribed medications to prevent the extreme condition of a heart attack or stroke. A very high blood pressure means that a person has hypertension, which can cause very detrimental effects on the heart, kidneys, eyes, arteries, and even the brain. This graph allows people to determine what their blood pressure means and the effect it has on their body. Arteries carry oxygenated blood away from the heart. They are thick, hollow tubes which are highly elastic, allowing them to dilate and constrict as blood is forced down them by the heart. Arteries branch and rebranch, becoming smaller until they become small arterioles, which are even more elastic. Arterioles feed oxygenated blood to the capillaries. The aorta is the largest artery in the body, taking blood from the heart, branching into other arteries that send oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. Venules, which are very small veins, merge into veins, which carry blood back to the heart. The vein walls are similar to arteries, but thinner and less elastic. Veins carry deoxygenated blood towards the lungs where oxygen is received via the pulmonary capillaries. The pulmonary veins then carries this oxygenated blood back to the heart. A major structural difference between arteries and veins is the presence of valves. In arteries, the blood is pumped under pressure from the heart, so backflow cannot occur. However, passing through the capillary network results in a decrease in blood pressure, meaning that backflow of blood is possible in veins. To counteract this, veins contain numerous one-direction valves that prevent backflow. However, there is one more structure to the cardiovascular system that can be of importance: the spleen. The spleen is a large, flat, oval organ located below the diaphragm. Its main function is to store blood. The size of the spleen can vary. For example, it may enlarge when the body is fighting infection. The size of the spleen tends to decrease with age. It is a non-vital organ, and it is possible to survive after removal of the spleen. Now that we have gone over the specific parts of the cardiovascular system, we can look at the cardiovascular system through a holistic approach. Blood circulates through a network of vessels throughout the body to provide individual cells with oxygen and nutrients and helps dispose of metabolic wastes. The heart pumps the blood around the blood vessels. The functions of blood and circulation are that it circulates oxygen and removes carbon dioxide, provides cells with nutrients, removes the waste products of metabolism to the excretory organs for disposal, protects the body against disease and infection, clotting stops bleeding after injury, transports hormones to target cells and organs, and helps regulate body temperature. I hope you guys have learned a few new things about the cardiovascular system and how it works to keep you alive every day. Thanks for watching!